The Prohibition era and Depression era fostered all sorts of criminals. With many new opportunities to earn money legally, such as bootlegging, and a small amount of available jobs, many people turned to the life of crime. This era is infamous for gangsters and other criminals ruling the big cities of the USA. Without further ado, let's begin this countdown. Andrew Kehoe was born in Tecumseh, Michigan on February 1st, 1872. Andrew Kehoe is most famous for the Bath School disaster, in which 44 people died and 58 people were injured. Kehoe was a farmer in Michigan and was under severe economic pressures. He had stopped paying mortgage on his farm and was under threat of being foreclosed. Many people think this and his defeat in the election for township clerk were the cause for his murderous rampage. It all started at his farm. On May 18, 1927, Andrew Kehoe firebombed his own farm, destroying most of the crops and all of the buildings. At almost the exact same time, the Bath School's north wing blew up in a fiery explosion, caused by dynamite and pyrrolol that Kehoe had been secretly planting under the school for many months prior. It was set off with a timed detonator that was planned to go off at the same time as his house. As rescue efforts were going on, Kehoe drove up to the school in his truck that had tons of TNT and shrapnel hidden in it. He shot the engine block, which detonated the truck. It killed himself, the superintendent, and injured several others on the site. After rescue efforts were over, another 500 pounds of dynamite were discovered in the south wing of the school that had failed to go off at the same time as the other end. This was the biggest mass murder at a school in American history. Born in Menfi, Sicily, on January 18, 1886, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Massiera was an early head of New York's mafia. He took over the Genovese crime family in 1922 and was killed in 1931. He was the head of one of New York's most powerful mafias and part of the Five Families. His rise to power in New York was a tough one, with Salvador D'Aquila and Gennaro Riina as his rivals. Between 1910 and 1920, D'Aquila fought with Joe the Boss for control of the Genovese crime family. His first brush with death happened in August of 1922. D'Aquila hired 2 gunmen to hunt down and kill Joe the Boss. As he left his apartment, he was immediately shot at and ducked for cover inside a nearby store. The gunmen shot up the store and hopped on their Hudson Cruiser getaway car. Remarkably, he was unscathed by this point-blank incident and earned another nickname, the man who can dodge bullets. His real rise to power started when he allied with Giuseppe Morello to take out Umberto Valentini, who was heir to their family. After Valentini was taken out in a setup by Joe the Boss and Morello, Joe became the head of the family and made Morello his advisor. Joe was now boss of the bosses and formally earned his nickname Joe the Boss. His decline started when he fought the Castamorisa family in the Castamorisa War. He lost the title Boss of Bosses and was later killed in a restaurant while playing cards on April 15, 1931. Frank, the Enforcer Nitti, was born as Francesco Raffaele Nitto in Campania, Italy, on January 27, 1886. He grew up as a neighbor of the Capones. He went to school until the age of 14, at which point he left home and worked odd jobs to provide for himself. He became involved with the Galveston crime syndicate in 1918. Later that year, he stole large amounts of money from Jack Nunes and Dutch Voigt. With this money, he started a liquor smuggling business. This business drew the attention of Papa Johnny Torrio and his underling, Al Capone. Under Capone, reputation soared. He was a very proficient businessman and expanded Capone's smuggling tremendously. He gained the trust of Capone, and when Capone went to prison for 11 years, he took over the Chicago outfit. He made the Chicago outfit branch out from gambling, smuggling, and prostitution to include extortion of labor unions. He headed the Chicago outfit until later he committed suicide after being accused of extorting Hollywood film business. He died on March 19, 1943. Meyer Lansky was born in Grodno, the Russian Empire, on July 4, 1902. He was born to a Polish-Jewish family. When he was a teenager, Lansky met Bugsy Siegel, and the two became lifelong friends from then on. Lansky also became very good friends with Lucky Luciano, whom he helped organize the murders of Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano. He and Siegel jointly managed the Bugs and Meyer mob. Lansky is most notable for his gambling empire and the extent of his profits. He was a member of the Jewish mob, and thus, before World War II broke out, he and his mob broke up many pro-Nazi rallies. Unlike many of the criminals on this list, the most serious crime that Lansky had been found guilty of in his more than 50 years of being a member of organized crime was illegal gambling. George Francis Barnes Jr., otherwise known as Machine Gun Kelly, was born in Memphis, Tennessee on July 18, 1895. During the 1920s and 30s, Kelly was a bootlegger along with a colleague. After he got in some legal trouble with the police, he decided to head out west with his girlfriend. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, he was arrested in 1928 for attempting to smuggle alcohol onto an Indian reservation. He was sentenced to 3 years in jail, but was a model inmate and was released early. After being released, he married Catherine Thorne, who made efforts to put his name out there and even bought him his first Thompson SMG. Kelly is most infamous for his kidnapping of Charles F. Urschel. He was a wealthy Oklahoma resident and paid the $200,000 ransom that Kelly requested. However, while kidnapped, Urschel gathered information and left clues that let the FBI quickly find Kelly. He was found guilty of kidnapping and bank robbery and sentenced to life in prison. He spent a good portion of his time on Alcatraz, where he was once again a model inmate. He died of a heart attack at the age of 59 on July 18, 1954. Charles Arthur Floyd was born in Georgia on February 3, 1904. He grew up in Oklahoma. However, he was known as Pretty Boy Floyd more commonly. His criminal life started at the age of 18 when he was arrested after stealing some coins from his local post office. After gaining parole from a 5-year sentence, Floyd joined the Kansas City underworld. Over the next few years, he committed bank robberies and built up his name. He was arrested many times for vagrancy and detained by police for questioning. On May 20, 1930, he was convicted of the Sylvania, Ohio bank robbery and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison, from which he escaped. Despite being a robber, much of the public viewed him in a positive light, claiming that when he robbed banks, he destroyed mortgage documents in the process. Floyd was accused of being an accomplice in the Kansas City massacre. In this event, Floyd, Vernon Miller, and Adam Richetti made a failed attempt at rescuing Frank Nash from police custody, supposedly. He was killed on October 22, 1934, in a cornfield behind a house in Ohio. Charles Lucky Luciano was born in Sicily, Italy, on November 24, 1897. He was born as Salvatore Luciana. Luciano quit school at the age of 14 to earn $7 a week selling hats. However, his rise started after he earned around $250 in a dice game. As a teenager, Luciano started his own gang and joined the 5 Points gang also. Rather than crime, Luciano's gang offered protection to Jewish children from Italian and Irish gangs for a small fee. He also learned the pimp trade during this time. During World War I, he met Meyer Lansky, his future business partner. His nickname most likely came from how he was arrested 25 times between 1916 and 1936, but spent no time in prison. In 1920, Lucky met many future gang bosses through the 5 Points gang and was hired by Joe the Boss to be a gunman for him. Another gangster, Arnold Rothstein, saw the potential for bootlegging alcohol and taught Lucky how to run bootleg as a business. Rothstein was a major mentor to Lucky and taught him how to look and act to make it as a gangster/mob boss. In 1925, Lucky was making a net income of around $4 million a year and owned the biggest bootlegging business in New York City. Luciano was soon the top aide to Joe the Boss and helped him out in the Castelmaurese War. During this time, Luciano started to make ties with other young gangsters and became known as the Young Turks. This group included Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Joe Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, Tommy Galgino, Salvatore Piccolini, and Tommy Lucchese. All of these youngsters believed that their conservative bosses were the reason that they were poor, while other gangs got rich. In October of 1929, Luciano was beaten nearly to death in a limousine. However, this encounter only made him more famous and led him rise to power much more easily, through media coverage. Luciano decided that he would eliminate Joe the Boss. He killed him and took over his crime empire as Maranzano's second-in-command. After this, Maranzano divided up the Italian-American gangs into 5 families. Luciano, Maranzano, Profaci, Gagliano, and Mangano headed the families. After Maranzano noticed that Luciano was a threat to his power, he ordered him killed. However, Luciano got wind of this plot beforehand and decided to act first. He sent 4 Jewish guards to go and kill Maranzano. After he died, many of Maranzano's allies were coincidentally found dead. These hits were known as Knights of the Sicilian Vespers. In the early 1930s, Luciano and his gang started to get into the business of prostitution. However, he was convicted and sent to prison for it in 1937. He appointed his consigliere, Costello, as the head of the gang while he was in prison. He was later deported and allowed to live freely overseas. Lester Joseph Gillis was born in Chicago on December 6, 1908. His pseudonym was George Nelson, or he was also called Babyface Nelson due to how young he appeared. His crime life started when he was working for Standard Oil and joined a group called the Strippers. They stole the tires off people's cars when they were parked. Through more and more acquaintances, Babyface joined the Toohey Gang. The gang started out with armed robbery and is famously known to have gone into people's homes, tied them up with tape, and stole their valuables. This is how they got their nickname, the Tape Bandits. On April 21, 1930, Nelson stole $4,000 in his first bank robbery. Throughout the 1930s, Nelson and his gang robbed more and more banks. They also stole jewelry from the Chicago mayor's wife. After this, Nelson fled west, where he picked up a famous bank robber named Eddie Benz. Together, they robbed a bank in Grand Haven, Michigan. After this raid, Nelson felt up to the task of starting his own gang. He recruited Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green. These men and some other local criminals robbed the First National Bank of Brainerd, Minnesota, for $32,000. Today that equals around $573,000. With his first lucrative robbery under his belt, he allied with John Dillinger and helped to break him out and some others from jail. With this new notorious member of his gang, they robbed the Security National Bank at Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and took around $49,500. 1 week later, Nelson and his gang robbed the First National Bank in Mason City, Iowa, and took around $52,000. Nelson died in what is known as Battle of Barrington. In this battle, Nelson shot and killed 2 FBI agents, Herman Hollis and Samuel P. Cowley. They had a shootout in which Nelson was shot 9 times, with seemingly no effect. He then killed Cowley. Hollis then shot at Nelson's legs with his shotgun and temporarily downed him. However, Hollis was out of ammo and hid behind a utility pole to pull out his service pistol. While he was hiding, Nelson got up and shot Hollis in the head with his .32 Winchester rifle. Nelson got in his car and tried to leave but later died of his wounds. John Dillinger was born June 22, 1903 in Indiana. He is possibly the most infamous gangster of the Depression era and led the Dillinger Gang. He got into crime when he had trouble finding a job and robbed a grocery store with his friend. However, he and his friend were caught. Due to this robbery, he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. While in prison, Dillinger stated, "I will be the meanest bastard you will ever see when I get out of here." While in prison, Dillinger met other infamous criminals such as Harry Pete Pierpoint, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, Ed Schaus, and Homer Van Meter. These men taught Dillinger how to be a successful criminal while in prison. After being released on parole, Dillinger immediately returned to crime. He stole $10,000 from New Carlisle National Bank. He was captured in Dayton, Ohio after being tracked down by police. He had plans to help the previously mentioned men escape prison. They escaped and became known as the First Dillinger Gang. Between June 1933 and June 1934, Dillinger and his gang supposedly committed 12 bank robberies. During one of these robberies, Dillinger was caught. However, he escaped jail again with the use of a fake pistol made of a potato. After that, he met up with his friend Hamilton, who was recovering from a gunshot wound incurred during a bank robbery, and they joined Babyface Nelson's gang. After his escapades with Nelson, Dillinger stayed at a brothel for a while. One day he went out to a movie with Hamilton and Anna Sage. However, Anna Sage had told the FBI about Dillinger's movements, and he was ambushed as he left the theater. He tried to run into an alley and get into a gunfight, but was shot and killed. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York on January 17, 1889. When growing up, Al's schooling ended at the age of 14 when he was expelled for hitting a female teacher in the face. He worked odd jobs around Brooklyn to help support his family, but came under the influence of gangster Johnny Torrio. Al saw Torrio as his mentor and followed his guide to becoming a gangster. At first, Al was in smaller gangs and moved up in ranking until he joined the 5 Points gang. It was here that he was slashed in the face and earns the name Scarface. At the age of 20, Al moved to Chicago after being asked to by Torrio. He initially worked as a bouncer at a brothel, but eventually became the right-hand man of Torrio at the head of Chicago's biggest crime organization, the Chicago Outfit. In Chicago, he and Torrio fought the Northsiders. After Torrio killed their leader, Torrio was shot and handed over control of the gang to Al. Al then quickly expanded the gang using violence and bribery to increase profits. He had more bouts with the Northsiders and repeatedly called for a truce, which fell through. Capone increased his power through widespread intimidation and bribery. Capone's most infamous crime is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which his men, disguised as policemen, lined up 7 Northside gunmen and killed them mercilessly. This gave Al a worse rep than he already had, and he was listed as public enemy number 1 in Chicago. He was arrested later for tax evasion and was released in 1939. However, his syphilis had progressed too far at that point, and he got paralysis. He was refused admittance into many hospitals, such as Johns Hopkins, but eventually got treatment. After this ordeal, he moved to Florida and remained there for the rest of his life in his mansion. He had a stroke on January 21st, 1947. The next day, he suffered a heart attack and died on January 25th, 1947. His impact on Chicago was irreversible, however, and he had created a huge underground crime syndicate that had roots even in the police system. Al Capone is undoubtedly the most infamous Prohibition/Depression-era gangster.